Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Sam Bates. I'm with the Market Intelligence team here at Open Minds. And today, as part of our weekly private roundtable series, Open Minds Executive Vice President Kim Bond and Senior Associate Sharon Hicks will be discussing adopting a new clinical service model from need to implementation. Kim Bond brings over 30 years of experience providing behavioral health treatment in the public and community settings to the Open Minds team. She currently serves as the Executive Vice President of Business Development. In this role, Ms. Bond focuses on growing the Open Minds client portfolio across all 9 verticals of the Open Minds business. Sharon Hicks has more than 20 years of experience in the health and human service field. She has extensive expertise and a wide range of experience in health plan management, clinical operations management, and technology. A recognized thought leader among peers, Ms. Hicks is a regular keynote speaker at industry conferences and association meetings, as well as an author of hundreds of articles and resources for professionals in both clinical and executive roles. Now, before we get started, we have a couple brief housekeeping reminders. While you are on mute during today's briefing, we are interested in any and all questions that you might have. Please feel free to submit those in the question box that should be on the right-hand side of your screen. And as a reminder, today's recording and PowerPoint will be available on the Open Minds website tomorrow. And with that, Kim and Sharon.
Thanks, Sam. Hi, everyone. Kim and I are going to talk today about adopting a new clinical service. And as Sam indicated, please feel free to put your questions in the question box. We hope that we are going to talk for about 40 or 45 minutes and leave plenty of time for questions at the end. Whoops, I apologize for my struggles with page up and page down because I seem to have a delay in getting my keyboard to listen to me. So if my slides go out of order a little bit, just forgive me. So our agenda today is deciding if a new service line is right for your agency, and then reviewing the plan of how you implement a new service line, and then, as I said earlier, leaving plenty of times for questions. So we're going to start with deciding if a new service line is right for your agency. And I am hitting page down. Let's see how that works.
You want me to advance it for you, Sharon? Let's see if I can do it for you.
Would you, Kim?
There you go.
Was that you? Okay, good. So I love technology. So obviously the first step is thinking about, do I need a new program? Why do I need a new program? So unfortunately, oftentimes people make a decision to create a new program or think about a new program because someone else is doing it and they heard that it was successful for this other person. So those are probably not the best mechanisms for deciding that it's time for you to put time and effort into a new service line. But these bullets demonstrate that the overarching decision tree that needs to be followed when you're thinking about, do I have a need for a new program? So there's an unmet need in your service area, or you realize that there are services missing from your continuum. Someone else has entered your environment and you're now losing market share because of those services. Or, and this I think is something that's going to come up more and more, you approach a payer or a payer approaches you, and in the context of value-based or in the context of innovation, you come up with an idea of how to develop a new service that's going to meet a specific need. So let's talk a little bit about these. If, as an example, you run a drug and alcohol program and you are currently providing an ASAM 3.5 level of residential. and you realize that payers no longer want to pay for longer term residential. So all of a sudden you get pressure to get people discharged by day 26 or 27 or by day 20. And you have always referred to your outpatient program when people leave the 3.5, you've always referred to an outpatient level of care. But now you realize that you have a need to create an IOP service, a 3.1 level of care. That's a step down between what you used to do and what you feel is currently being indicated based on the way insurance companies are managing those particular levels of care. So that's a demonstration of a need for the service if you're going to continue to provide good care for the people in your clinical programming. You have to develop a new service line, which is that step down between the residential program and the outpatient program. You need something that's going to sit in the middle and allow you to have the spectrum of services. So that's a good example of there's a need for those services. And it may not be that the need is unmet. It may be that other people do provide that, but you want to keep those consumers of services within your network. In the other component of this, and the other thing to talk about with this one is with the increase of public money, of private money coming into the behavioral health industry, and I will talk about this in a little bit, we will find ourselves having competition for specific components of treatment. And so we may need to, in a more targeted way, create a service that captures a need that we weren't even aware of earlier on. So these three critical factors to consider are, I think, really the key to making this decision. Is there a need for the service? And that speaks to demand. What's it going to cost me to do that service? And then when I come up with that, is anyone willing to pay it? And then the feasibility component, do we have the capability to provide the service? And we'll go to the next slide, and we'll get into these a little more in detail. So there are a number of different ways to determine need. I think a needs assessment or a gap analysis is really one of the most useful tools for this. Once you've documented out what the need is, so again, going back to my example, I need to be able to discharge people by 21 days. They are not ready for outpatient treatment. They need 2 to 3 weeks of more intensive IOP services. And there are no other IOP programs that I run. So that's a needs assessment. That's a gap analysis. There's a gap between discharging people and getting them to my outpatient program. And that gap analysis can be done either internal to your environment or it can be done geographically. And then the other is a health plan or a payer has indicated a need for the service, or you've indicated a need that you've gone back to payers and health plans to say, hey, if you all do this special program, you're going to be able to reduce spend in this population of people. And so, somehow or another that needs assessment demonstrates that it's economically, financially viable. And then the third way is that, the requests are coming from the bottom up, right? Consumers, advocates, family members are all saying, hey, I read about this, or, I heard about this in another part of the country or another part of the city. And have you ever considered adding this to your service offerings? So next slide. This, I think, is really the key, obviously, is what's it going to cost to do it, and is someone willing to pay for it? So a lot of the work I do is related to data warehousing and data reporting, and a good friend of mine who's been a kind of data warehousing mentor has said to me, everybody wants a full service data warehouse, but no one is willing to really pay for what it is required to build that existing and really well functioning data warehouse, because that price is usually outside of people's capabilities. So you have to figure out who's willing to pay you and how much are they willing to pay you. And that doesn't mean that you need that firm contract initially. It just means you have to understand it generally. So if the payer says, yeah, that's great, I'd love that service, I'm happy to fund your IOP. You currently get paid $500 a day for your 3.5, and for your IOP, I'll pay you $50. It's very unlikely that you're going to want to build that service, because one, you're losing revenue on your $500 a day service, and two, $50 is probably not going to cover what it really costs you to do the IOP. So you're juggling both components. You're kind of saying, from a feasibility standpoint, payer, would you pay me X amount if I was able to demonstrate this kind of performance, this kind of outcomes, et cetera, et cetera. And if their answer is absolutely not, that's higher than I usually pay, then you need to go back to the drawing board and figure out how are you going to create this new service line and have it pay for itself. And then you need to conduct a financial analysis with a focus on determining unit cost, and we'll talk about that on the next slide. So the financial analysis is really an opportunity to just create, models to look at. So once you've said, okay, there's a demand for the service, and I think that there are payers who are willing to pay for it, now we have to figure out what we're going to ask for and where are our margins. Where's the component that's above the cost? Where's the component that's below the cost? Where's the mean amount it's going to cost me? You really need to start thinking about what's the total completely fully loaded cost model. So what's it going to cost me to do startup? What's it going to cost me to do program development? What's it going to cost me to have physical plant, remodeling if I need to do that? What's it going to cost to build all the staff that we need? And one of the things I like to recommend is that you calculate the cost of the program at 50%, meaning 50% filled with clients, 75% filled with clients, and then 100% filled to whatever that capacity number is. So calculating the capacity number is important. If you have 5 clinicians and your construct is that each clinician can have a caseload of 20, then fully staffed and fully loaded, you have 100 people. So you can use that model to say, if I had 100 people in the program, my daily billing would be X, my percent collected would be Y. But what if I only have 50% and I have my full costs of the program? So you need to come up with that, that revenue and expense projection at those different parameters, because that will give you the granularity that you need to finish the financial model to say, it's financially worth our while if we can get to X, and it's not financially worth our model unless we can get to Y. So once you have that, you can calculate the time it's going to take to recoup all of your startup dollars. So the startup dollars have to be considered outside of the operation dollars, outside of the running of the program dollars. But once you come up with your unit cost, you have to load those in somehow, because you need to recoup those. You can't create a program that has a positive bottom line, but you spent a lot of money setting it up and you never get that money back, right? So there has to be that kind of fully loaded and then ongoing construct of what your unit cost is. And so you're going to use all this calculation and use all of these analyses that you do to determine your break-even point and your return on investment potential. Next slide. So, from a financial perspective, there's really only two types of local programs. The first is a program that has a net cost that's positive, meaning your total expenses are lower than your total revenue. And the second is a program that works the other way, where your total expenses are more than your total revenue, and so you require a subsidy from another source. If you go to the next slide, I think that, one of the things that happens when you think about your programs in those just binary way, right? This program makes money, this program doesn't make money, just on service revenue alone. You realize that there are programs that lose money that you do need to have. And sometimes those might be new programs that you develop, new service lines that you're aware that they're going to function or move in arrears, but you need to create those, and you need to create them because they provide an inroad to your other more profitable services, because it's an expectation of the type of service that you provide that you will have X or Y. And so we need to begin to think about the cost of those charitable or mission-driven programs as one of the ongoing expenses, so that if we do decide to do a new service line, we may put the burden of one of those programs that doesn't cover its own bottom onto that new service line. So when you think about the slide that we just talked about, we were talking about the recoupment of all your investment dollars and your return on investment. You may want to put the non-compensated component of one of those services into that new service line, because they do all work together in concert. But at the end of the day, your bottom line has to be positive. So when you think about those programs, the programs that lose money but that you need to keep, then you want to be able to clearly explain why and how it is central to the mission. So let me give you a very concrete example. I run an outpatient program, and my actual outpatient service itself makes money. But in order to get people into my outpatient program, I run an assessment program. And because of the cost of people who can do diagnosing, that program never covers its own bottom. It's a money loser. But I determined that I cannot run my organization without a good assessment program. So where does the coverage for the assessment program come from financially? And the answer is from all of the programs that benefit downstream from having that assessment program. So the outpatient program, maybe it has to cover 50% of my deficit in the assessment program. Maybe 2 or 3 of my other programs have to cover some of that deficit. So sometimes I'm going to create a brand new program that I am going to create knowing it's a loss, but the benefit to the organization comes from the downstream for that program. When that happens, it's kind of been traditional that business people will say, well, don't do it. Don't create programs that will lose money. But the reality is, in healthcare, especially in health and human services care, we do sometimes have to do services that don't quite cover their own bottom. So then you need to match that with a service that makes money, so that on net, when you put everything together, you're still in that positive, return position. Next slide, please.
Sharon, I just want to say before we leave this slide,
Yeah.
Some organizations also decide that this is where their fundraising dollars are going to go to support those programs that don't quite cover their bottom line. And that's also an option, of course.
Of course. However, and I think that's a really nice segue into this next slide, Kim, because you're absolutely right. we have in general depended on fundraising funds, program funds, grant funds to cover those programs that haven't been able to pay for themselves. And that was okay up until a few years ago. But where that makes long-term provider organizations vulnerable is that there's been a huge increase in venture capital, private equity money coming into healthcare startups. What those organizations do is that they kind of surgically pick a component of the workflow which is profitable, and they put that in place and compete with organizations that are the kind of traditional providers who have an overhead that includes all kinds of things, not just the overhead for that specific program. So they will grab market share because they also have money to do advertising and marketing and, kind of slick promotion. And what you can't have happen is you can't make up the deficit in lost service revenue with grant funds or fundraising forever. It's not sustainable. So you can do it for a short term, but you have to figure out how are you going to, in the long term, have that net positive bottom line? Because our vulnerability to the private equity and venture capital funding increases the more that we are depending on non-service related revenue to balance our books. And so, whether these venture capital and private equity investments are successful in the long term, in the short term, they have an opportunity to do some damage to us. And let me give you one very concrete example. There was a new for-profit company that was funded by venture capital that was focused on providing MAT and only providing MAT. And so they worked collegially with traditional substance use providers and wanted to become the MAT resource for them. And that relationship was quite complementary. The traditional providers didn't have to incur the expense of the MAT, having the physicians, getting the medications, et cetera, and could concentrate on the providing treatment. But then that same organization said, we also should do med management groups like IOP. We don't want to do IOP, but we want to do something that's like IOP. So clients started going to groups at the MAT provider and then were resistant to coming into groups within the IOP environment. And so the traditional provider, which at first said this is very complementary, this is symbiotic, all of a sudden it was much more parasitic than it was symbiotic, in that consumers felt like it was a duplication of service, and because they were already at X environment to get their medication, decided we'll just stay here and start doing some treatment. So the traditional provider couldn't really argue against that, and in fact had a significant financial burden, as they thought, well, how do we get our MAT clients from transitioning into MAT group clients at this other organization? And again, that's not a common scenario necessarily, but it illustrates that there is competition in our behavioral health space in a way that there hasn't been before. And even when you think about like the talk spaces of the world, in general, the traditional long-term provider organizations have not made most of their revenue associated with care for people who are mild to moderately ill. And those focuses for the talk spaces of the world are on those people who are mild to moderately ill. But we have to be aware of the bottom line for all the services that we do, and we have to make sure that if we are creating a new service line, it either contributes to our bottom line, contributes to our census and other programs, or provides revenue for us to fund some of our currently unfunded or underfunded services. Next slide. And so this is just some information about some of the money that's coming in. You know, we have Talkspace having a public deal around $1.4 billion. ABA therapy companies. ABA is one of those areas where there's tremendous amounts of private money. EHR, digital mental health, just you know, astronomical growth in the amount of money being spent on those kinds of services.
And Sharon, I think we just learned recently that there's even more money being spent this June 2021 than it was June in 20. So it continues to go up.
It continues to go up, yeah. And so the summary really is a new service line development must take in all of the financial and the economic assessment. And if you're not going to demonstrate a return on investment for the new service line, then the new service line should be considered only when it supports the downstream mission and additional monies for other components of your service line. It's really important not to just say, hey, everyone's doing telehealth, I need to develop a telehealth line, without going through some of these assessments, because you may find yourself having spent money that you never can recoup. And we can't afford that kind of financial vulnerability as grant money and gift money and program funding is also drying up at the same time. And with that, I will turn it over to Kim.
Thanks, Sharon. So now that you've done your, well, let's back up one slide here and see if I can, oh, there we go, one more. Sorry, everybody. There we go. Making sure that when you're doing your feasibility analysis, you know, you've done your financial analysis, you want to do your total feasibility analysis here when you're thinking about whether or not you should. And that's really the first, when you're looking at these, the two questions that you're asking yourself is, can we do it and should we do it? So when you're looking at the feasibility determination, there's just a few of the critical points, and Sharon has really done a great job in going over some of these as well. One of the first things, especially if you're a nonprofit, you do want to ask yourself, does that service fit with your mission? Maybe you've asked yourself that way back in the beginning when you decided even to start down this road. Is it something that's included in our mission? Do we need to change our mission? Is it mission creep? So that's really something important to think about. And then we talk about, can we get into the payers network for this service? Who's going to fund it? You also want to consider, when you're thinking about your feasibility, do you have a facility if you need that for this service, or do you have an existing facility? Are you going to need to build one or remodel one? Do you have enough startup capital? Are you going to need a loan, or do you have a credit line? How are you going to do that startup capital? Another incredibly important part is, can you find the staff? Across the nation, behavioral health providers are really struggling with that workforce shortage on many different levels. We hear that time and time again with many of our clients in all areas of the country. So can you find the staff needed? Be sure you consider, how are you going to market it? Do you have marketing? Do you need help with marketing? Who would be your referral sources? Where would you market? Many of those things you want to consider when you're thinking about the whole feasibility plan. And then don't forget about the IT component of this. A lot of times we find organizations don't think about, oh, we will have to modify our electronic health record, or maybe we need some different kind of business analytics tools. So when you're going through your financial or your feasibility analysis, it's not only your financial analysis, but you need to also consider all of these points as well. And then if you answer yes to both the can and should questions, then we look at implementation. So in implementation, it really is taking what your idea was. You had this idea, you've done some of the preliminary work. Now we're going to take it from concept to reality. And you may have noticed, I don't know if you can see, but I talk with my hands, so I'm gesturing a lot here, even though we're on video. So when you're thinking about an implementation plan, again, we're going to take just your idea, what you've been thinking about, what you've done some initial analysis on, and really take it back into reality. For Open Minds, we have this 4-step process, and it's important to remember that all along the way, you can make that go, no-go decision. And don't get caught up in that mentality of, oh, I've already put so much work into it, I have to go forward, because you really don't. And we're going to talk about that a little bit along the way. So for us and our 4-step process, we're going to talk about the service line design, really important, so you get this vision fully fleshed out. Once you've got that design in place, we're going to talk about all that service line launch preparation. That's going to be all the details and the nitty-gritty kinds of things. We'll continue on with Sharon's example of an IOP, perhaps. Once you've got all the nitty-gritty details worked out, we're going to then discuss how do you manage that launch. You're getting ready to launch, you're getting closer to the launch, how are you going to manage that? And then we'll talk a little bit about the actual launch and a pilot test program on that. So those are the 4 steps that we talk about at Open Minds whenever we're doing implementation. So step 1 is that service line design. It's really, really important when you're thinking about this service, what makes it unique? Why would people use your service as opposed to somebody else's service, a competitor service? Or maybe even, why would they use your service at all? Why is coming to you and using your service better than, first of all, not doing anything, or to a competitor? When you're thinking about that, you're developing your unique selling proposition, your USP, and that also helps then to define your market positioning statement. You're telling the world, your clients, your potential market, here's why you should use us. And there can be many, many different ways you could include in this. Maybe you're a low-cost leader, and that's fine and dandy. Your performance is exceptional. You're available. Maybe the service is available 24/7 or nights and weekends. You have some great technology. Your customer support is great. Many different ways and facets you can think about when you're thinking about this your service line. In Sharon's example of the IOP, maybe there's no other IOP in the area. So there is a unique selling proposition. People don't have to drive miles and miles to get to an IOP. It's locally there. Or maybe you really focus on a particular segment of, maybe you have opioid dependence, or you have women and children. So whatever your unique selling proposition is, you want to know what that is when you're thinking about your service line design. Because then you're going to take that material and define and map that operational flow. So you really think about, how is this all going to work? How is this going to work from start to finish? What departments in our agency are going to have to interact with each other? What are staff going to do? How is this going to work all the way through, including capital investments? Do we need that new facility? Do we have to modify something? Are we going to have to buy new equipment or hire specific staff? So when you're thinking about your new service line, you really want to put in here as much detail as you can as you're designing that service and developing those workflows on that. Because, let's see how this is all building on each other, you've got that operational flow, and you've thought about all these different segments. Now you're going to finalize that price and that pricing structure. Remember, you did a lot of work back when you did your financial analysis, when you're just kind of thinking about it, when it was just an idea. But now that you've really put some more meat on the bones of your idea, you really want to make sure the pricing structure and your unit costs are all playing out, that you've considered all those new parts, and redo that financial analysis to make sure you're right on with your return on investments, your break-even point. How do you know you're going to recoup everything, including your startup costs, your day-to-day operational cash flow that you need, your investment capital requirements? Are you going to be able to cover all of that? And then really, truly important, and so many times agencies forget this, are those cash flow requirements. It's not just, do you have money in the bank to make the capital investment, the capital improvements, but do you have enough money to sustain the program for however long it takes to start getting those first revenues in? Remember, the first day you open your doors, you're not going to get cash in the bank immediately. So you have to have the cash in the bank to float that service line for, could be 30 days, could be 3 months, could be 6 months, depending on what service you're doing. You want to make sure that you have those cash flow in hand. You want to be able to make payroll, pay your rent, pay your utilities bills. So those are all the things you have to consider. Then when you think about all this, you think about, do I have a unique selling proposition? Is there a reason people should come to my service, use my service, as opposed to either not doing something or going somewhere else? Why should they come to my IOP service? Then I've mapped out everything, and I'm looking at my cash flow. Maybe you decide, gosh, with all this, I'm going to need a little bit more cash than I thought. We don't really have the cash flow right now that we could sustain this for as long as it might take to meet my break-even point, or even to start generating some revenue. So maybe I need to hold off on that. You may decide that the capital requirements are just too much. Right now, the supply chain with the pandemic, it can take things, maybe you used to get them the same day. It could take 16 weeks to get some equipment or some new furniture or some other kinds of things. So all that has to be taken into account as you're thinking this through and you're really designing your service when you're going to make that go, no-go decision at this point. But if you've taken all that into account and you're thinking, yeah, I still want to open that IOP, it makes sense. We're the only IOP in town. We're only focused on women. We have the cash flow. We know how to do this. We've mapped everything out. We're going to go for it. Then we're going to go on to step 2. And then step 2, it's the service line launch preparation. The first phase was you're designing it. You're really thinking it through, how it's going to look. This step is really where you get down to that nitty-gritty detail kind of work. You're going to want to develop that implementation plan. We're going to talk about flow charts, operations manuals, and you want to make sure you're building it not only to operate and maintain the service line, but also to understand and make sure you're meeting all those regulatory standards, and you're going to build some success standards in this phase. So step 1 was the design, how it's going to look, and now this is the detail part. So when you're thinking about that operations roadmap and you're developing that implementation plan, this has to be very detailed. Your implementation plan has to have not only the tasks, but who owns that task and a timeline. Remember when in the first phase of the design, you kind of mapped out how it was going to go, what a service line was going to look like, how things are going to flow. Well, now you're putting pen to paper, and deciding, how do I get to those steps? How do I do that service line? What needs to happen? Who's going to go out and look for a new facility? Or who's going to be in charge of the remodel? Who's going to order the equipment? What about hiring that staff? How are we going to do that? Who's going to develop the curriculum if that's what you're needing? So all that implementation, all those tasks to get to your design, your service design, who's going to do those and what's going to be the timeline to do that? It's hard to get too detailed on an implementation plan. And while you're working on that, it's important to know those productivity standards. Remember, you did your financial analysis, and you kind of know when we need to get here to break even. Well, how much productivity do you have to get there? And whatever productivity means, it could be, this is how many clients we need, this is how many visits we need, this is how many staff hours we need to be able to bill for, this is how many case management visits, how many housing units we need. Whatever it is, your productivity standards, this is the time when you're going to really put some numbers to those. What do we need to actually produce to meet our standards, to meet our expectations? Develop those. And then create those service line flow charts. Again, from maybe it's the referral to the last visit or the last time they're with your folks. How does that look? Remember, this is all in your mind, so you understand it, but creating these service line flow charts helps you explain it to other people. If you're going to be hiring new staff, you're transferring existing staff in, you want to make sure that it's all mapped out and you've got the service line exactly how you think it should go, so other people can understand it and not just in your brain as well. And then this next one, No one likes to write operations manuals. No one. Maybe Sharon does, but no one else really likes to do operations manuals. And all of us have said, you know what, we'll get it up and running and we'll figure it out, see how it goes, and then we'll write up operations manual to meet what we're doing. We don't ever do that. So at this stage, just write operations manuals now while you're doing it, while you're in that creative mindset, while it's all fresh in your mind, you know how it's supposed to go. It'll be better for you. You can always change it later if you need to. If things change, you can alter your operations manual, which is much easier. It's much easier to revise an operation manual than to start it from scratch. So if you're doing it now, it's going to be much easier for you. And then as you do bring on those new staff or transfer those existing staff, they'll have something to follow. So maybe 6 months down the road, when you're off doing something else, your team still knows how to do things. They have a training manual or the operations manual to know how it's supposed to go. So please don't forget to do that, those operations manuals. And then, of course, as we already talked about, make sure that you're conducting that final regulatory check, whatever that means. Are you working within your licensure? What are your state regulations for this service? So all your implementation plan, your operations manual, your flow charts, make sure, double check to make sure that you're meeting all the regulations for your service line. The next part, when you're doing your launch preparation, is making sure you're developing those success standards. Remember we talked about that? You're going to define your activity-based and performance metrics. How do you know when you're doing well? And by what timeline, what date do you want these metrics? Sharon talked about at 50%, at 75%, at 100%. How do you know, at each of those phases, those steps, how do you know if you're being successful? And what are the dates you need to hit those by in order for you to really realize your financial and your feasibility projections? So you want to make sure you're defining that activity-based and performance metrics, and then not only define them, but then create those performance dashboards for that new service line launch. Something easy that you can quickly look at. You can even point your board to, look at, these were our performance metrics that we set out, and here's how we're doing on it. So it will show you how you're doing along the way, easily and quickly. That's the difference between just establishing your performance-based metrics and then creating your performance dashboards. Your dashboards are just an easy look. Think about, we always use everybody uses the analogy of your car dashboard. It's easy to look at one gauge to know how much gas you have. That's the kind of system that you want to have in place to know if this new service line is really doing what you thought it would do and being as successful as you want it to be. Then remember, even with all this information in hand and you've done all this work, you still can make that go, no-go decision. Again, don't get caught in that trap that's saying, oh my gosh, we've put so many hours in this, we got to keep going. No, you don't. When all is said and done, if this is no longer feasible for whatever reason, maybe a global pandemic hit, then you make the no-go decision. However, if you're still going and things are still looking good and you're excited about it, you've got all your operations manuals done, then it's time to do that service launch management. Now, this is the time when you're you've got all your plans, you've got your implementation plan done, you're just about ready to go. You're going to start actually doing things. You're going to make sure that your marketing and promotional plan is out there. Who are you going to market to? You're marketing your new service line. You're promoting your new service line. You're hiring staff. And remember, when you're hiring staff, again, look at your 50%, 75%, and 100% timeline. You don't need to hire staff for 100% capacity in the beginning. So what's your timeline for hiring the new staff? When do you need to start? And again, we talked about that workforce shortage. So you may need to start sooner rather than later to make sure you have folks. Or maybe you're going to transfer staff into your new service line. Who's going to backfill in their old jobs, or you're going to promote people? What's happening? But this is the service line launch management is when you're really starting to put some of these things in place and developing that launch project and that tracking plan. Here are the things we need to do to make sure we check them off our list so we can open our door and we have that tracking plan. You probably want to designate maybe a project manager to make sure that it's keeping everybody on track, kind of keeping the wheels on the bus and things are moving forward. Once you're doing this, remember now between this and as the next step is opening the doors and letting people in. Still, even though you're right here at the precipice, you're about to open the door, you're about to start that new service line, you can still make the no-go decision before you open the doors and started making those new clients. Maybe you weren't able to hire the staff, maybe for IOP services that you thought. You don't have as many certified drug and alcohol counselors as you thought you were going to do. Whatever it is that you're attempting at this time, you can still make that go, no-go before you do that formal launch. And then finally, hurrah, we're here. We've done all this work. We started with an idea. We figured out there really was a need. We did our feasibility, our financial analysis. We did all our design and our implementation plans and our operations manual, all the stuff that nobody likes to do, but we all have to do. And now we're at step 4. So here you finally get to let the horse out of the barn, open your door, implement your service plan. When you're doing it, it's a great day. Don't forget to monitor that implementation and your performance metrics. This is when you're so happy now that you did all those dashboards, you put all those success metrics in place, you did those operations manuals because things are now humming. Your staff knows what to do. You've showed them the workflows. They all know that. They've studied the operations manuals. They study your flow charts. Everybody knows what they're supposed to be doing. And you have that beautiful dashboard that shows, yep, we're being successful, or no, we're not. And one of the great things about those dashboards and looking at your success metrics and how you're actually doing is that you can modify. If you know anything about Open Minds, you know we preach data, data, data. When you have the data and you've established those success matrix, you look at the data and say, yep, it's working exactly like we thought it was going to. Or you might find out, no, something's not quite right, and you can make those little adjustments to get back on track. So again, data is king. All right, cash is king, but data is maybe the next step on there. And so those performance metrics and those dashboards are what's really, really important, and you're going to be really glad you have them at this point in this step 4 in the service launch and pilot test. Once you've looked at that and you've celebrated, you've started your services, you're very happy that things are going on, and you can decide whether or not you're going to continue this plan, continue the service line, you're going to make your modifications. Maybe you want to start a second pilot. Depending on what modifications you want to make, maybe a whole new launch, it may be just an expansion of what you're already doing. Maybe you're taking it out of a pilot program into a full launch. You're going to go across all the service areas, not just a very small service agency. Or you can't actually make a final no-go decision. Even after you've launched it, even after you've done all this work. I don't know about you, but I've heard Monica, our CEO, Monica Oss, say many times, if you're going to fail, fail fast and move on. Sometimes things it's a really good idea on paper, or you've done all this work, but when clients start coming in and you're dealing with real life, whatever reason, it's just not working out as it should have. And you've tried to modify it, it's not working. For whatever reason, you need to make this no-go decision and pull the plug. And that's okay too. It's okay to try new things and have them not work, but you have to be quick to realize that it's not working and then pull the plug. Okay, so we've gone over how you start from thinking about an idea. Somebody has told you, or you've done your gap analysis to through your financial analysis, your feasibility study, and a 4-part implementation plan. And hopefully this has been useful for you as you're thinking about whether or not you should develop a clinical service line and then how you would actually do that. And I think Sharon and we have time for some questions. So Sam, do we have any questions that have come in?
Hey, Kim. Yep, we have a couple questions that have come in. The first one is, given the current state of everything, do you see any specific trends of particular types of service lines growing in popularity? Is there anything really hot right now?
I mean, I think teleservices are on everybody's mind. People are wondering what's going to happen if the feds and when the feds change the tele rules, and what happens when states go back to their normal standards that they lifted during the public health emergency. So I do think that that's an area where there's lots of comments, questions, projections, thinking, what is the future going to look like and what are we going to do? to keep some of the remote services in place. Monica and others have said very clearly that some kind of a hybrid model is likely going to be where we end up. It's unlikely we're ever going to go 100% back to office-based services. But there was an interesting article just this morning on one of the news groups that said patients want to go back to the office. So, there is that's kind of one of those fortune teller events, and I do think that's an area that people are considering. Do I expand my service? Do I create a service? How do I right size it?
And we're seeing also in specific service lines, sort of, we're seeing a lot of interest in both senior services, older adult services, and IDD services. We're seeing more and more people get interested in expansion and creating some of those services as well. I'll share this again for you. There you go.
Gotcha.
Do you have any more other questions, Sam?
Yep. Here's another question: is what are some of the main challenges opening a new service line right now?
For me, I really think you have to consider the staff shortages and whether you can get the staff. That's one. And then all the other things that we talk about, what health plans are really looking for, kind of where the field is going with integrated services, and not just integrated for primary care and behavioral health, but are you also integrating any of the social determinants of health and some of those other treatment models? So those are some of the challenges I think all provider agencies really need to consider. Whether you can get the staff doing the integrated care. We're seeing a lot, of course, of bundled rates and alternative payment models, value-based reimbursement, of course, are some of the things that come top of mind to me. I don't know about you, Sharon. What are you thinking?
Yeah, no, I agree with everything you just said, especially want to second that whole staffing problem that I think is getting more and more attention. I also read a lot of the international healthcare news, and what's interesting is from the World Health Organization's point of view, they're talking about not if there is another pandemic, but when the next pandemic hits. And interestingly enough, the United States is not really talking much about hardening its system so that it doesn't fall apart again during the next pandemic. And so I think that there will be some conversations about how to do that, how to shore up your environment so that when the world gets disrupted again, we don't have that stop and start crisis that we had at the beginning.
I think you're right, and also your mention of telehealth services. And actually, we're starting to see a decline in telehealth, people using telehealth services. They like the face-to-face, as you said, Sharon. But you should not take that to mean that you can stop telehealth or you need to stop paying attention to telehealth. It's going to be part of our service array. So don't give it up. Continue to improve it. And just like Sharon said, if and when the next pandemic hits, you'll still be ready. You won't have to make that extreme pivot that many of us had to make to suddenly implement telehealth because you already have it there.
Exactly.
Great, and I think we maybe have time for one or two more questions. Here's one. Could you please discuss strategically, at what point should you bring in a service line leader? Is it worth bringing in one early and then helping them develop the line with them in mind, or developing a service line exactly the way you want it and then bringing somebody in to fit that?
That's a great question, and I think it really speaks to that financial analysis component. As Kim was talking about writing the operations manual and saying that, probably I'm the only person in the world who enjoys writing service operations manuals. I think that is one of the keys to this, right? Do you need a new person to run this new service line, or is it part of an existing component? It's a part of an existing person's portfolio now. And who is going to write your procedure outlines? Who's going to monitor it? So if you decide that it's something that's new and nobody in your environment knows it, you do need to bring your service line leader in sooner rather than later. But understand that now you're in this go, no go position where you may be affecting someone's life. So either you bring them in on a short-term contract, you bring them in on a contingency basis, understanding that they will not be having a job. This is a no-go. You know, or you just make it part of your sunk cost and you decide ahead of time where you would put this person in your organization if you do a no-go decision. But you have to make sure that you're not putting yourself in the position where you then say, oh gosh, now we have to do this because we brought in Jane. And what are we going to do with Jane? And we can't, you know, terminate her because we just brought her in. You know, the whole kind of sunk cost fallacy component, it probably needs to expand to include staff and people. So you have to consider that. But you know, the administrative burden of management of the new service line is absolutely one of those primary fixed costs that you have to include in all of your financial analyses.
Yep, what Sharon said.
Okay, and I think one last question. What are some of the successful strategies that you've used to market your service lines to the local and regional populations?
Great question. First, making sure that you are reaching out to your payers, your health plan, whoever normally pays for your services, make sure you're outreaching to them. You also want to make sure, if this is appropriate, you're outreaching to consumer groups or to support groups, to associations. All of those sorts of things come to mind. I'm sure Sharon probably has other ideas. Sorry, Sharon, one other thing. What we recommend is, especially if you're doing this to health plans, we have you can call it a partnership concept statement or a pitch deck. It's a very short 10 to 12 slide PowerPoint slide kind of presentation that you would put together. It's not a selling proposition, but it really is just introducing your agency or this new service line that you could easily send off to health plans or other folks so they get a snapshot of what you're talking about, what outcomes you either have or you're expecting as another marketing tool for you to use. And Sharon, what else would you think of?
What Kim said. But the other component is that generally speaking, the more traditional providers don't really think about marketing in the way that you have to if you're doing a new service line. So, you know, again, that marketing is everything Kim said, especially, you know, to the payers. But also, how are you internally marketing? How are you marketing to your own staff? How are you explaining to them the rationale for the new program? How are you helping your staff make referrals of some of their existing clients to your new program, right? So, you know, it's really, you have to really think about it as a marketing exercise as opposed to a communications exercise, which I do think that generally we do well. We know how to communicate, but we don't really know how to sell and market. So I think it's really taking that, you know, that other side. And using someone like Open Minds to help you come up with that.
That's a great idea, Sharon. And when you're thinking about marketing, don't forget to market to potential staff. I think sometimes we forget about that you can also explain why you're a great place to work or why people may want to come and work for you. So that's also can be part of your marketing strategy or marketing thinking. And of course, Open Minds can help you with that.
Okay, perfect. Thank you both very much for today. I think that's all the time we have. Just a quick reminder for everyone, the recording for today's briefing and PowerPoint will be available tomorrow on the Open Minds website. Also, please consider joining us again next Thursday as we have Open Minds Executive Vice President Laird Sapir and Senior Associate Nicole Garris, and they'll be talking about designing best-in-class websites. You can sign up at openminds.com under the Events tab, listed as Executive Web Forums. Thanks everyone for joining us today. See you next week.
Bye everyone.
Thanks, everyone.